I don't want to.
Fallout 4 is one of the most contentious games of the franchise. You can have over 200 hours in the game and still find yourself frustrated or confused at certain design choices that made their way into the game. Now there are some people who really enjoyed the new additions that came with Fallout 4. Things like settlement building and the improved gameplay allowed a whole new audience to enjoy what had once been reserved for only die-hard RPG fans. On the other hand, you had people that felt left out in the cold by the degrading complexity and immersion-breaking updates that made their way into the formula. Today we're going to focus on the latter group as we try and nail down just what made Fallout 4 so disappointing or incomplete to many players.
Let's just hug this out and get it over with.
Quick side note, this will contain spoilers for the game, so if you'd rather not hear those, please turn back now.
Think about your hero when you're at ground zero.
Fallout 4 featured some amazing companions. Characters like Piper or Nick made people look back upon the wasteland favorably. Unfortunately though, there was one character that stood out among the rest, but for all the wrong reasons. Enter Preston Garvey. It's hard to focus the community's hatred for Preston down to a few items, since honestly there are just so many reasons, but I'll do my best to provide a quick summary as to why he's so loathsome. We first meet this handsome young devil at the Museum of Freedom, as he and his band of misfits are under attack by a group of raiders and are barely holding their own. As the sole survivor, we're tasked with saving their sorry asses in what will become just one of many favors that Preston will demand of us during our time in Boston. At this point, many players might take sympathy on Preston. I mean, he seems to be a good guy that's just in a bad spot who's just trying to do right by his people. And hey, he's got a cool hat. Well, it's too bad that we later come to find out that it's his poor decision making that led his people to be slaughtered in Lexington, as he had the bright idea to try and set up shop in a city that was overrun by feral ghouls. So after their numbers dwindle down to just 10, he decides that his next brilliant idea will be leading them to Concord. Oh, there's raiders there. Hey asshole, you ever hear of scouts? Anyways, we save Preston and his ragtag group of people, and what does he do? He decides he's going to squat at your old neighborhood of Sanctuary. You know, that place that you probably spent the last 40 minutes clearing out and building from the ground up? Nope, that belongs to Preston and Mama Murphy now. Alright, so we're off to a bad start. We've saved this guy, and he turns around and decides to freeload off of all of our hard work. Surely he'll appreciate and offer to provide us with some kind of assistance or resource. Nope!
Now, as always, there's another fire to put out. I'll mark it on your map. I've got something else for you to look into. I've got something a bit different for you.
At least we know where they're hiding out. Here, I'll mark it on your map.
He'll demand that we go off and reestablish the Minutemen. You know, that faction that was so cowardly that they let an entire town get sacked and massacred? Great idea, asshole. So from here, he'll send you on a never-ending series of mundane side missions that have you going from settlement to settlement, doing the same loop over and over again. You talk to Preston, who tells you to go to a farm. You go to the farm, who tells you they were attacked by raiders. Kill the raiders, then talk to the farmer, then talk to Preston, and then do it all again. God damn it, I just want this stupid quest marker out of my data screen, but you can't turn in a quest to Preston without him giving you another one.
If you've got time, something else has come up.
The idea being that after all these settlements rejoin the Minutemen, we'll have established the militia once again. Yeah, great. I'm sure the Brotherhood of Steel will be really afraid of Clyde over there and his fucking pitchfork as they eviscerate his corpse with a laser rifle. And you know what the best part of all of this is? When you actually end up getting attacked by the Institute later on in the game, do any of these settlements come to your aid? Nope, you're on your own. I guess they just had better things to do than help you after you went and murdered hundreds of raiders at their insistence. So you might be thinking, hey, it's fine, it's a Bethesda game. They're gonna let you become the leader of the Minutemen within seconds, and then Preston won't be a big problem. And you'd be partially right. We get the title of General after doing like 2 missions for the guy, but does that mean that we're able to call the shots now? Of course not. Literally nothing changes. All of the Minutemen still inhabit Sanctuary, and you can't force them to move. And you still need to go help settlements as Preston sits on his ass reminiscing about how great the Minutemen were. Cut 2 shots of hundreds of dead corpses at Quincy. Oh, and worst of all, if you want to go save your son after you've finally found a way into the Institute, you better hope that you've earned enough good boy points with Preston. You want to know why? Because if you haven't saved enough settlements, Preston will have the balls to tell you this.
It'll have to wait until we get the Minutemen back from the brink.
What? And this is about the time where we go and we do this. Seriously, we've done nothing but help this asshole, and it's not even as though we'll stop helping him once we get our son back. But as soon as we actually need something from Preston, he's like, nah man, can't do it, gotta sit in this chair over here. Hey Preston, my son could be getting fucking tortured, and you won't let me save him because your shitty settlements are in a bad spot? Oh, and what happened to us being the supposed leader of the Minutemen by now? If this were a real militia, he'd be getting fucking shot against a wall for insubordination here. All in all, fuck you, Preston. Now, I'd love to say that Preston and the Minutemen are the exception to the rule when it comes to factions in Fallout 4, but honestly, they're just a symptom of a larger problem. These factions are all pretty weak, and I don't mean in the sense of their ability to exert their will on others. I mean, the Brotherhood has an impressive flotilla, and the Institute can basically teleport at will, which is honestly a huge plot hole, but if we get into that, we'll be here all day. In Fallout 4, the major factions are the Brotherhood of Steel, the Railroad, the Minutemen, and the Institute. Now, I will concede that each represents a unique perspective on the problems facing the Commonwealth, but in Bethesda's attempt to ensure that each were distinguishable from one another, they've robbed each faction of any possible nuance. Now, this was done to ensure that their messages weren't muddled or hard to follow, and the result is honestly exhausting. Every person from a given faction is just so blindly committed to their ideology that they seem to be indoctrinated.
I hope you decide to become one of the pillars of the community.
Father is more than just our leader. He is our creator.
I mean, it would have been nice to have at least someone question the methods of their group or whether they were actually doing the right thing in the face of rebuilding civilization. And Dance's mission doesn't count. A character shouldn't be forced to confront that they're a fucking robot to realize that the Brotherhood of Steel is just too inflexible when it comes to technology. The most frustrating example of this is the Institute, which I actually find quite fascinating. As someone who graduated from university and felt really disenfranchised by my discipline's inability or unwillingness to act pragmatically to improve the world, the Institute is an organization that quite literally lives in its own bubble. And just like those within my discipline, they seem less interested in the actual goings-on of people's regular lives, and more interested in just studying it for some abstract period of time where they'll actually begin helping the surface dwellers. I mean, this facility has access to clean water, amazing technology, and medical supplies, and the best idea they've come up with to help civilization is killing people and replacing them with one of their robots to act like some weird analog to Invasion of the Body Snatchers. When you first meet Father, he tells you about all the good the Institute does, and you sort of believe him as you go around and talk to all these department heads. But even after you find the darker side of the facility, such as the FEV program or the fact that synths have been attempting to escape en masse, he won't budge. He won't accept any kind of culpability for his faction's activities. And this is especially infuriating when you consider that one of the Institute's assets murdered your wife, his mother, to which he says,
"It seems her death was an unfortunate bit of collateral damage."
It's as though Bethesda couldn't allow these groups to actually deviate from their boilerplate ideologies, and it just results in these cookie-cutter groups of people that offer no complexity to the narrative. Oh, you sided with the Brotherhood, you must not trust humanity with technology, or I guess you just love power armor. Oh, you joined the Railroad, I guess you must be a sympathetic soul who wants to save synths who have found their consciousness. Oh, you joined the Minutemen, you must be a masochist who likes connecting your nipples up to car batteries.
What the hell?
Now look, I understand that games can only offer the illusion of choice, but there really seems to be no attempt to mask how one-note these groups are. It's honestly quite disappointing that they don't really ever seem to evolve through time in the Commonwealth. Sure, the Minutemen return, but have they really learned anything about what resulted in their original failings, or are they just destined to make the same mistakes? I mean, as I already stated, they didn't come to your aid once the Institute actually attacked. And this is actually a huge missed opportunity. It would have been humanizing to see Preston distraught after he realizes that there's something fundamental about the Minutemen that just doesn't work or needs to evolve if they're able to survive. Oh, and one last thing. The disparity in resources between the factions are really immersion breaking. I mean, in no universe should the Brotherhood of Steel or the Institute have a problem stomping out the Minutemen or the Railroad. I don't care what backwards rationale you provide, a fully militarized force with power armor would have no issue finding and killing everyone in the Railroad. And there's no universe in which the Institute loses against the Minutemen. It's already been established that the Institute can teleport resources anywhere. So why not just teleport in hundreds of thousands of coursers at once? Or just teleport a rock above everyone's head and then they're all dead. I also don't even understand why the Institute attacks the Minutemen. They're not even doing anything that would catch their attention, let alone their aggression. But maybe they just hate Preston Garvey as much as I do.
Got a doll, baby.
I love her so, nothing else like her anywhere you go.
Now before people go and assume that I mean Boston or the Commonwealth by this, let me be more specific. I don't like how Fallout 4 takes place 200 years after the Great War, mainly because this length of time makes the rest of the world make absolutely no sense. To put this into perspective, 200 years before now, Karl Marx was born. Electricity didn't exist for another 50 years. But despite this, in Fallout 4, after taking place 200 years in the future, there are still tons of houses that offer great loot. There are incredibly valuable resources like stimpaks or ammunition that are still left in heavily trafficked areas, while places like Sanctuary look like they're in a state of disrepair closer to a few decades, not 2 whole centuries. And there are even working terminals placed throughout the world, which, I mean, is just absurd. I mean, computers break down all the time, even now, even after being cleaned and maintained for years. But Fallout ostensibly wants us to believe that not only do these computers survive a nuclear holocaust, but they also haven't been destroyed or been made unusable in the subsequent 2 centuries that followed. Now, this has also occurred in games like Fallout 3 as well, so I'll give it a pass, but what I can't give a pass is the way that Fallout uses its stretch of time to offer insanely asinine questlines related to this passage of time. Worse still is that it does so more than once. While maybe one of the questlines that I'm going to get into might seem like a novel idea or a Wild Wild Wasteland style of event, they repeatedly use this premise to construct some really questionable content that is quite destructive to not only your immersion, but to the lore of the franchise. Don't believe me? There's an emergent quest that has you walking past a home near University Point. You hear a child's voice off in the distance and you discover it emanating from a fridge. You might think in your head, oh, someone just shoved a kid in a fridge as some kind of joke, but that's when this stark realization begins populating your brain and you realize the true horror of this situation. This child is actually a ghoul who has literally been in the fridge for the past 200 years. I'm sorry, but you know what it's called when you lock someone in a dark, isolated space for even a small amount of time? Solitary confinement. You know, the thing that's used as punishment to drive prisoners insane?
It's pitch black. I can't see my hands. I'm talking just because I suppose it's given me something to hear.
Now, I don't know about you, but I can't imagine a greater hell than being forced to spend 200 years having nothing to do but stare at the inside of a fridge. So this might be acceptable if this was one part of a joke quest. I mean, it's not great, but it would be acceptable. Well, the second part of this quest is even worse. You go back to the childhood home, and lo and behold, his parents are still alive, and they're ghouls. And they're literally less than a 10-minute walk away from where their son was. I mean, I know it's a long shot, but they didn't spend 2 seconds trying to find their own child after the war?
Jason! 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 Jason!
To give him a proper burial? Anything? This scenario is not only insane, it raises a few unforgivable questions. Namely, why is this the first and only child that we've seen that's been turned into a ghoul? Why isn't he insane or feral at this point? Why are we the first person to stumble upon this fridge? How has he inhabited this fridge for over 200 years without it being knocked over or jarred loose? If a child can be a ghoul and ghouls live forever, will they stay children forever? I mean, it seems to be that way since after 200 years he's still a kid, but what happens if ghouls decide to have a baby? Does it come out as a baby and just stay that way? Okay, so maybe this was meant to be taken as a joke quest that was meant to be a little bit surrealist but not meant to be taken seriously. Well, this is not the first or last quest that will focus on the timeline of Fallout 4 taking place so far into the future. It's not even the worst one either. So do you remember that pushy Vault-Tec salesman that you met at the start of the game that was just really annoying? Well, when the nukes hit, he didn't die. Instead, he turned into a ghoul, and the game would have you believe that after 200 years, he's not only remained the same exact person that he was when you last met him, he's even wearing the same clothes. And you know what? I kind of want to commend Bethesda for this, because they realized that the only iconic thing about him was his outfit. So that begs the question, why was it so important to bring him back if that's the case? And none of this is to mention how the timeline is just chock full of plot holes thanks to Bethesda desperately trying to explain inconsistencies like how Kellogg could be alive for all of the events of the game. Now this has all made me want to understand why it was decided to have Fallout 4 take place in 2287. And that's when I realized through my research that it's because Fallout 3 took place in 2277. That's right, the only reason this game takes place 200 years in the future is so they could have callbacks to Fallout 3. For example, Elder Maxon was actually a child in Fallout 3, and there was also McCready there as well. The entire reason we bastardized the canon of Fallout is for fan service that honestly 80% of the player base will either not know or care about, but you can be sure that people will care about the stupidity of having a child locked in a fridge for over 200 years. Even if we're kind and say that these callbacks might represent an interesting way of showing the development of some of these characters or groups, they essentially retcon the Brotherhood of Steel's portrayal in Fallout 3, as Dance even says that they were just too focused on altruism during that period of time. So I guess in 10 years, Elder Maxon was able to both become the leader of the Brotherhood and fundamentally change how they execute their mission. This might have been an interesting concept because the Brotherhood was essentially taking the place of the Enclave as a powerful group of militant purists who think they know what's best for the Wasteland. Too bad they seem to be changing the Brotherhood every 2 seconds to serve whatever purpose they need for the storyline. If the next entry in the franchise were to take place in China, I'm sure there would be some ridiculous scene where they explained how the Brotherhood was able to establish a fraternity in Asia somehow. I mean, they just can't help themselves. The Brotherhood is just too iconic to be absent from a Fallout game now, no matter where it takes place. And this all culminates in a world that just seems to be making it up as it goes. If you had told people that the game took place 60 to 100 years after the bombs fell, it would feel a lot more believable. But I guess then you wouldn't be able to shoehorn an M. Night Shyamalan style twist into your narrative, which leads us to...
Minus the negative, latch on to the affirmative, don't mess with Mr.
Fallout 4 opens with an impressive live-action cinematic that showcases Fallout's new status as a pop culture icon. Gone are the days where we only had 8 talking heads to converse with in an entire game, as we now have the money to film an opening cinematic that could put many blockbuster films to shame. But as flashy as this brief cinematic is, it continues the same problems that have plagued Bethesda before. Most notably, it continues to illustrate their willingness to flaunt their production value at the cost of the core game. For one, the narration playing over the cinematic comes before the character creation screen.
Serving in the army. Wondered when he'd get to go home to his wife and the son he'd never seen.
Now this wouldn't be a problem in a previous Fallout title where the dialogue of our character was delivered through text prompts, but as previously mentioned, Fallout 4 decided to go with a voiced protagonist instead. The result of this decision means that hearing the male protagonist's voice without having any chance to select our gender seems to point us to the idea that the male character is somehow canon. And this is further cemented by the male character being a veteran while the female character is only a lawyer. And don't get me wrong, being a lawyer is nothing to scoff at, but in a game that has many players choosing to shoot guns and utilize power armor, it doesn't exactly explain how she knows how to fire these weapons or climb into said suit of power armor. Now to many this might seem really trivial, and I'd agree, but it just serves to highlight the other oddities of the storytelling in this game. For example, why are we wasting precious minutes characterizing a random salesperson that we neither know or care about? Why does this introduction feel so cramped and only allow a player 4 minutes to interact with their wife and child? You know, the motivation that's meant to carry the entire narrative of your over 40-hour game? Why does the game keep repeating the phrase, "war never changes," 3 times in the opening? I mean, I think we get it. And none of this is to mention the most fundamental flaw of the entire structure of the story itself. Fallout 4 is meant to be an open-world RPG. This means that it's meant to afford players a level of freedom that they rarely get in AAA releases. But despite this, the game's narrative itself is diametrically opposed to this core tenet. It does this by establishing a narrative dissonance for any player that chooses to not go immediately looking for their son. If this doesn't make sense immediately, let me explain it this way. Let's pretend that Fallout 4 is real, and someone has kidnapped your son and shot your wife. Now imagine that you leave the vault hot on the trail of this murdering psychopath, and you're asked to go help the Minutemen, or return a kid from a fridge to his family, or get interviewed by Piper. I don't know about you, but I'm not going to feel great screwing around in the wasteland when my toddler could be getting fucking eaten by a ghoul for all I know. And do you see the problem here? If you actually believe the story that Bethesda's written, you can no longer go off and do side missions without feeling guilty. But if you don't actually become invested or care about the story, you can go off and do what you like. What this does is punish players that might actually be treating your scenario as real or authentic. It's a catch-22 where players aren't able to both enjoy the story and feel immersed unless they play the game as intended. If you want to look at a game that does this well, look no further than GTA 5. It's an open world game, but the way it progresses its narrative is through heists that you as the player initiate. This makes sense both in the logic of the game world and allows players to engage in side missions at their discretion. This means that there isn't a dissonance between your motivations and that of the character. And you might be one of those people that just boot up GTA 5 and don't really care about any of that. But in a game like Fallout that's meant to be narrative driven, it should construct its story in a way that allows players to feel immersed without railroading them into feeling forced to do the main story mission. And, oh god, what else? Let's talk about how they treat the big twist and sub-twist at the end. For those that haven't played the game, it turns out that you were refrozen after your wife died and it's actually been 60 years, not the 10 that you had originally thought. This would be really obvious for anyone paying attention, so Bethesda created some ridiculous red herrings in the form of a synth that was meant to look like your child, and a man who has apparently been able to live for over 100 years due to, quote, enhancements. All of this is in the service of a twist that has you finding your son, who is about 20 years your senior now. And this is a really interesting dynamic. You have a son that's actually lived longer than you have. Not to mention the parallels that this draws to Fallout 3, where you were the son chasing after your father, you now play as the father chasing after your son. But these ideas are never really explored or elaborated on. They use this as a dun 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 kind of moment and basically discard it afterwards because it served its purpose. We're able to talk to Sean a few times about how unfortunate it is that we are robbed of our time together, but there are never any conversations that make it feel like we're actually talking to our son. Can you imagine if we discovered he had a nervous tic just like us? Or if we were able to explain some of his idiosyncrasies and where they came from? It could even be a song that he likes that his mother used to sing to him when he was in his crib that he never knew about. Wouldn't it have been an amazing and tragic way of talking about the whole situation? Instead, Sean talks to us like we're his grocer, even using us to replace Kellogg.
We will show them that if they interfere with us, the very technology they value so highly will be turned against them.
Which, again, would have been really interesting if they actually goddamn used this as a way of explaining how the Institute was so detached that your own son would use you as an asset. Who gives a fuck, Dad? Go fight with my robot army and find me a reactor, idiot. And that's the real problem with the story. It's not nitpicking about timelines or inconsistencies. It's the way in which it turns a blind eye to the interesting concepts and philosophies that it alludes to. I mean, for God's sakes, we have a new life form in synths, and the way that Bethesda treats this incredibly interesting and nuanced topic is, robots can't be human. Robots can totally be human, they have dreams. Now there's a much better piece of media out there about this topic, Ex Machina. It explores feelings of authenticity when it comes to a consciousness that can be created, all of which is underscored by an ending that can either humanize the robot or reaffirm that she isn't really human. Now, Fallout 4 doesn't need to have an incredibly cerebral narrative, but what's the point of introducing a topic like this when you don't even talk about something as simple as Asimov's 3 laws or the Turing test? I hate to keep talking in hypotheticals here, but imagine if Father could actually be persuaded enough to have us go and perform a test on one of these supposedly deviant synths. I mean, you could literally just plagiarize Blade Runner's opening scene and it would still be 100 times more effective than anything that made it into the final cut of the game. If this all sounds like I'm whining, it's because Bethesda continually flirts with good storytelling, and it just seems that they want to discard it halfway through its execution, and it gives me this narrative case of blue balls so large that I could bowl with them.
Sometimes he thrills me through and through, sometimes he's sweet, sometimes he's true.
Now if you thought the previous topics covered in this video were excessively long, just wait and see how much I can nitpick this one. Unlike previous entries in the series, it was decided that Fallout 4 would feature a voiced protagonist. This decision might go down as one of the most misguided things to ever happen in the franchise since that awful Brotherhood of Steel game. For those that might not be terribly into the RPG genre, the major draw of these games is being able to forge your own path and be who you want to be. This is accomplished through being able to play the game in a variety of different ways and being able to have responses that align with you and your choices. Fallout New Vegas offers a master class of this. It offers speech checks that are tied not only to your charisma, but also to your other skills. You're good at explosives, you can answer questions about that topic. You have 1 intelligence and it's a wonder that you're able to breathe on your own. You'll have unique speech options that illustrate how incredibly stupid you are. This is not only fun, but it offers players a reason to go back and do multiple playthroughs as different characters. This adds a layer of immersion where you don't simply have to play the game as a Joe Schmo. It's not meant to be an Uncharted game where you play as Nathan Drake. You're meant to be the one writing the story through your actions and your decisions. And this can evolve throughout your time playing the game as well. So with all that being said, you know what the best way to completely rob your audience of this aspect of your game is? Having a voiced protagonist who places their own inflections and subtleties to every single line of dialogue in the game.
Ashes, go home. Aaron misses you.
To better explain what I mean by this, let's take a look at one of the first moral decisions that players encounter in the game, in which speech plays a vital role. We stumble upon Drumlin Diner and find a standoff occurring between what looks to be raiders and the owner of the diner. Apparently her son purchased chems, but still owns them caps. After quickly talking with Wolfgang outside, you can go and talk to Trudy and see what other options you might have. So in a past Fallout game, this would result in you walking up to a character and being presented with a number of options that you would read in your head. From there, you'd be able to decide whether these align to your character that you'd chosen to play. In Fallout 4, this is subverted by a voice actor's interpretation of what that delivery would be. This is further obfuscated by the new summary dialogue that gives a 2 to 3 word explanation rather than the full sentence, as though players suffer from some form of crippling ADHD that won't allow them to spend 2 seconds to actually read the full sentence. So applying this to Drumlin Diner, we have 4 options presented to us as we talk to Trudy, who says that she won't pay up. For example, let's look at the offer help option, which is bizarrely placed where the sarcastic option usually lies. We as the player have no idea how our own character will offer to help Trudy. Will we offer to kill Wolfgang, or will we simply offer to pay off her son's debt? This makes something that was so simple in previous games incredibly frustrating, as we don't know how an avatar that is meant to represent ourselves will behave. It's sort of like a gamified version of schizophrenia where you can't even depend on your own stand-in to correctly communicate your ideas. And even if by some miracle the summary perfectly aligns with what you had imagined would be said, there's next to zero chance that the line delivery will be in the same way that each individual player had imagined it. So let's pretend that the dialogue will be delivered sarcastically as we had initially assumed. In my head, I read the line as, "Look, you owe them money, if you just pay them then this will be over." But my character reads it as,
"Look, you owe them money. If you just pay them, then this will be over. Everyone walks away without getting hurt."
All right, I'll pay.
In this way, Fallout 4 has turned an RPG into a choose-your-own-adventure story. You get to make choices for a character, you don't get to actually be that character. The Silver Shroud is great, but it represents one version of what amounts to be hundreds of other characters that could have been constructed had the game not chosen a voiced protagonist. And I just have to ask why. I'm trying to think of the benefit of this apart from being able to list it as a feature on a slideshow. And this is just incredibly stupid to me because I can't recall many players clamoring for this before the release of the game. And the amount of resources this cost was incredible, as Todd Howard indicated that they needed to record over 175,000 lines of dialogue. Can you imagine if they instead spent these resources towards bug fixes or improving side quests? To quote Jurassic Park, Bethesda was so preoccupied if they could that they didn't stop and think if they should. And this decision also infects other aspects of the story, as the game seems unique in the way that it railroads players into what they wanted to happen. For example, no matter what kind of character you're playing, by the end of this conversation, you'll need to kill Kellogg. In other titles of the franchise, you could be playing a high charisma character who understands that Kellogg was a tool of a larger plan. Or you could convince him to betray the Institute and tell you how to save your son. If you're a pragmatist like I am, the way the game forces you to kill your only tangible resource into finding your son is really frustrating. Now, if you're a hot-headed character who can't manage his anger, this makes perfect sense, but this is the problem with dictating rather than offering your player actual choices. I hope that in Fallout 5 we return to the original system, because it's honestly more immersive, it's cheaper, and it offers writers more flexibility in how they craft their narrative. I like playing a character that's different from myself. I mean, that's what escapism does. It allows us to view things from a different perspective, as it sneakily infiltrates how we feel about certain topics. This is what makes an RPG great, not the production value or a voiced line of dialogue. Now with Fallout 5 on the horizon, or maybe even being announced by the time I get this video out, I can't help but be cynical and think that the new game will just continue to have the same problems that have plagued the studio for over a decade now. There may be a new faction or perhaps a setting outside of America, but I actually want them to focus on the R part of the RPG. I hope that we can at least have an option to toggle on the voiced protagonist and have companions that aren't just there to give us busy work. I hope we can get factions that evolve and feel real through their actions. Bethesda has an incredible framework with Fallout, one that could act as a blank canvas for some really compelling stories and unique narratives. And I genuinely hope that they utilize it, because if I find another 200-year-old kid in a fridge, I'm gonna scream. So that's my video on some of my complaints for Fallout 4. As I was toiling away on this video, Fallout 76 was announced, and I'm really excited about this, but there are some reports that it'll be something completely new. Like most people, I fear change, and hearing that it'll be some kind of multiplayer survival game really has me worried. Especially when I have this slinking suspicion that this is going to be used as an excuse to introduce loot boxes or some other form of microtransactions where they don't belong. But I'm going to hold off my judgment until any of that actually gets confirmed. Now this video actually took me a lot longer than I thought. I want to continue to make these long form analysis videos like this one. I actually have a full-time job, so it's actually a little bit challenging to go and collect footage, write the script, and then actually do the video editing, especially considering that I'm really terrible at the editing part of things. I plan on putting out a video at least once every 2 weeks, but let me know what you think my next topic should be. If you want, you can check out my last video that was on the absolutely abysmal writing in Far Cry 5's ending, which actually served as a catalyst for this channel, as I needed to expel all of the bile that game produced in me. As always, here's a video of my dog Edie to guilt you into subscribing. Thanks again for watching, guys. Edie.